So there are 193 member states in the United Nations, but there are 211 member nations in FIFA.
Yeah, which is just a wild statistic to think about.
Right. Today, we are pulling apart the blueprints of an organization that is literally larger and, in a lot of ways, more globally unified than the UN itself.
It completely reframes how you look at the sport.
Yeah.
When you realize the sheer scale of the administrative machinery required to keep those 211 nations aligned, you really start to see international football less as a game and more as, well, a marvel of transnational governance.
Absolutely. So welcome to the deep dive. If you're a fan listening to this, you probably only interact with FIFA when, like, a massive tournament rolls around.
Right, you buy a jersey, you fill out a bracket.
Exactly. You scream at your television.
Yeah.
But our mission today is to look at the engine under the hood. We're diving into the official organizational documents, structural organograms, and some very recent dispatch updates from April 2026.
Which give us a really clear picture of how things are running right now.
Yeah, because we're going to explore the sprawling bureaucratic, legal, and developmental systems that actually govern the world's most popular sport. Managing global football isn't just about scheduling matches.
Far from it.
This is an entity with its own internal judicial system. It directs global infrastructure projects and navigates geopolitical diplomacy on a daily basis.
And that level of coordination doesn't just happen organically. It requires an incredibly rigid, meticulously designed architecture.
For sure.
To understand how it operates today, you really have to look at the foundation they laid way back in 1904. That was the baseline.
Wow, 1904.
Yeah, and the core philosophical challenge they faced back then is the exact same challenge they face today. I mean, how do you convince sovereign nations with vastly different cultures and economies to surrender their sporting autonomy to a centralized set of rules?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because imagine trying to organize a group chat where 211 different countries all have to agree on the exact same set of rules.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Right. That is essentially FIFA's daily reality. It operates almost like a massive global franchise model, like McDonald's.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, because if you buy a Big Mac in Tokyo, you expect it to taste exactly like a Big Mac in Chicago.
Hmm.
Headquarters sets the strict formula, and the independent operators, which in this case are the 211 member associations, they have to replicate it perfectly on a local level.
Yeah.
If a penalty kick means something totally different in Brazil than it does in Japan, the whole product fails. The illusion just breaks down.
What's fascinating here is that that franchise analogy is really spot on. Without uniform rules and, consistent application, a tournament like the World Cup simply could not exist.
It would be chaos.
Total chaos.
Right.
Football is a universal language, sure, but you still need a strict grammarian to ensure the syntax translates seamlessly across billions of fans. Their core mandate is to promote development from the grassroots up to the elite levels. But none of that development matters if the application of the sport isn't standardized. So they established that 1904 baseline to ensure that whether you were playing in a massive stadium in London or on a dirt pitch in rural Argentina, the parameters of the game are identical.
Which makes perfect sense on paper. You need that standardization so the sport can scale up to these massive, iconic platforms.
Like the Men's World Cup, the Women's World Cup, the Club World Cup.
Exactly. But here is where the reality of managing that franchise gets incredibly complicated. Maintaining a 211-nation coalition requires a highly specific and, frankly, a highly political power structure.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's look at the architects at the top of the pyramid, with a president and a secretary general who is actually pulling the strings. Like, is the president basically a king, or is there a balance of power?
Well, the leadership dynamic is really fascinating because it blends elements of standard corporate governance with outright international diplomacy. At the very top, you have the president, Gianni Infantino, who was elected at the extraordinary FIFA Congress back in February 2016.
Right.
And alongside him, managing the vast administrative engine, is the Secretary General.
Right, Matthias Grabstrom.
Yeah.
Who, looking at the sources, actually had a really interesting trajectory into the role.
He really did.
He stepped in ad interim in October 2023 and then was formally appointed by the FIFA Council just a few months later in May 2024.
Yeah.
Which, if you've ever worked in a massive corporation, keeping $1 billion ship steady as an interim executive while the board decides whether to formally appoint you, that is no small feat.
No, it requires an immense understanding of both the strategic vision and the operational realities on the ground.
Yeah.
But to really grasp how power flows between the president, the secretary general, and the member associations, you have to understand the distinction between their two main governing bodies.
The Congress and the Council.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because to an outsider, Congress and Council might just sound like interchangeable bureaucratic jargon.
Oh, sure, they sound very similar.
But the way they separate power here is crucial, isn't it?
It is the defining feature of their governance structure. So the FIFA Congress is the supreme legislative body. You can think of it as their ultimate parliament.
Okay, Parla.
This is where all 211 member associations gather to vote on the most sweeping foundational changes to the sport.
And here's where the politics become really visible.
Mm.
Because in that Congress, a tiny Caribbean island has the exact same voting power as Germany or Brazil.
Yes, the one country, one vote system.
Right. Which actually explains a lot about the president's schedule.
Hmm.
If you look at Infantino's recent movements, like in mid-April 2026, he was out joining a good governance seminar for leaders in Miami.
And I saw that, yeah.
And then 2 days later, on April 15th, he's in Washington, D.C. at a forum lauding the impact of the upcoming 2026 World Cup. He's not just cutting ribbons, he is actively campaigning and coalition building.
Exactly. Because when every single member association holds an equal legislative vote, the leadership has to constantly engage in geopolitical diplomacy just to maintain alignment.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. And bringing 211 global representatives together to manage monthly or even quarterly strategic operations is just logistically impossible.
Right.
And that is where the FIFA Council steps in.
So if the Congress is the massive all-hands parliament, the Council acts more like a corporate board of directors.
That's a great way to look at it. They are the main decision-making body in the intervals between those massive Congress meetings. They keep the engine running.
Got it.
But the nuance lies in how they delegate the actual work. The FIFA statutes dictate a very strict separation between strategic oversight, which sits with the leadership and the council, and the executive operational functions.
So they don't do the day-to-day stuff themselves.
Right. They rely heavily on specialized committees to do the administrative heavy lifting. The people setting the overarching strategy are intentionally separated from the people executing the day-to-day administration.
I have to push back on that a bit, though.
Okay, go for it.
Because when Infantino was elected in 2016, his stated mandate was repositioning the organization as credible, trustworthy, modern, professional, and accountable.
Yes.
Which is great PR language.
Yeah.
But given the astronomical amounts of money flowing through global football, how does an internal committee actually enforce trust? I mean, if you're keeping the strategy and the operations separate, what happens when someone just decides to ignore the rules entirely?
Well, that is the multi-billion-dollar question, and it leads directly into one of the most complex and arguably most essential mechanisms they operate.
Their internal judicial system.
Exactly. You cannot manage a global economy of this scale without a dedicated legal framework to enforce the rules.
And this is where my mind was completely blown by our sources. Because when we think of sports rule enforcement, we usually think of, like, a referee handing out a red card.
Right.
But the legal machinery here operates on the level of an international court. We're talking about off-pitch referees wearing legal robes.
Basically, yeah.
It's all laid out in Article 52 and Article 54 of their internal statutes.
And those two articles are the teeth of the entire organization.
Tell me about it.
So Article 52 officially establishes their core judicial bodies. That consists of the disciplinary, appeal, and ethics committees.
Okay.
And then Article 54 establishes the Football Tribunal, which passes decisions relating to football-related disputes and regulatory applications.
So the Football Tribunal is basically like a dedicated Supreme Court just for soccer.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to picture how this actually works in practice.
It's complex.
Right, because, say, an Argentinian player who is currently playing for a club in Spain has a contract dispute with a buying club in England.
Okay, a very realistic scenario.
And maybe his agent is based in Monaco, and his image rights are registered in a completely different tax haven. If that dispute goes to a standard European court, it would take, 5 years just to figure out which country has jurisdiction?
Oh, easily, if not longer.
So FIFA just bypasses the traditional legal system entirely.
They have to. If we connect this to the bigger picture, traditional international courts are just far too slow.
Yeah.
They're too fragmented, and frankly, they lack the highly specialized expertise to handle the pace and nuance of the global transfer market.
That makes sense.
I mean, if a player's career spans perhaps 10 to 15 years, they cannot afford to spend 5 of those years locked in jurisdictional purgatory.
They'd lose half their prime playing years.
Exactly. So the Football Tribunal provides an insular, rapid response legal framework designed specifically for the mechanics of the sport.
But how do they actually enforce it? Because at the end of the day, they aren't a sovereign government.
Yeah.
A football tribunal judge can't send police to an English club's headquarters to seize assets. What is their actual leverage?
Their leverage is access to the ecosystem.
What do you mean?
Well, if a club or a member association refuses to comply with a ruling from the Football Tribunal or the Ethics Committee, the organization can simply revoke their license to participate.
Yep.
Yeah. They can ban a club from international transfers. They can ban a national team from competing in the World Cup. It is the ultimate trump card.
So they basically hold the keys to the kingdom.
Exactly. You are entirely free to ignore their internal courts, but the consequence is exile from the global game.
Wow. When you frame it like that, it really highlights why that 1904 baseline of uniform rules is so powerful.
Yeah, it's a closed-loop system.
You play by the rules they set, you adjudicate disputes in the courts they built, or you just don't play at all.
Precisely. And, maintaining the public narrative around that closed-loop system is an enormous undertaking.
How dead.
That is why they operate a highly centralized media services department out of their headquarters in Zurich.
Right, because when you have disciplinary committees handing down sanctions or the Congress passing new sweeping legislation, you need a tightly controlled communications hub.
You need to broadcast those decisions to the world, ensuring the messaging is unified and clear.
Which naturally makes you wonder about the output of all this.
How so?
Well, we have this massive legislative Congress, an executive council, an internal Supreme Court, a centralized PR machine in Switzerland. It is an incredibly expensive bureaucracy to maintain.
Oh, without a doubt.
But the revenues generated by the Men's World Cup, the Women's World Cup, and the Club World Cup are staggering. So where does all the money go once the lawyers and the executives are paid?
This is where we shift from the rigid legalistic side of the organization to its actual on-the-ground impact.
The development side.
Right, because the tournaments are the highly visible financial engines, but the output of those engines is global development.
And we are seeing aggressive pushes on that front recently, specifically in women's football. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the dispatch updates from mid-April 2026, the focus isn't just on the traditional European or South American powerhouse.
Oh, well, they're looking globally.
Right. There's a massive spotlight on the women's FIFA series, providing a launch pad for Mauritanian women's football. That was on April 15th. And at the exact same time, Côte d'Ivoire is gearing up to host a women's FIFA series event.
And those specific locations are highly intentional.
How so?
Well, hosting a women's series in Mauritania or Côte d'Ivoire isn't just about playing 90 minutes of football. It is about capacity building.
Okay.
It proves to local governments and regional sponsors that investing in women's sports is viable, structured, and supported by a global framework. It creates a developmental ripple effect.
I see. Because imagine you're trying to build a grassroots women's football program in a developing nation. A mandate passed in a boardroom in Zurich doesn't magically build a pitch in Mauritania.
No, it doesn't.
You need logistics, you need coaching education, you need physical equipment.
Precisely. And that gap between the Zurich boardroom and the local pitch is bridged by their regional development office.
Right. We saw those in the organogram.
Yeah. These offices are stationed around the world to provide daily, localized support to the member associations. They are the ones tasked with taking the broader strategic goals, like, say, advancing women's football, and figuring out how to actually implement them within the specific cultural and economic realities of a given region.
So it's the franchise model again, but with regional managers ensuring the local branches have what they actually need to succeed.
Exactly.
And it goes beyond just grassroots play. The logistical planning required at the elite level is mind-bending. Just look at the preparations for the Brazil 2027 Women's World Cup.
Oh, the base camp brochure.
Right. In April 2026, they're already releasing the team base camp brochure, which, releasing a brochure might sound like a trivial administrative task to an outsider.
But consider what a team base camp actually entails.
It's massive.
You are coordinating high-security hotels, elite-level training pitches, advanced medical facilities, and secure transport infrastructure for dozens of national teams.
And they're doing this a full year in advance.
A full year. It requires coordinating with local Brazilian municipalities, security forces, and the hospitality industries. It is a massive infrastructural undertaking.
Which brings us to perhaps the most surprising aspect of their operations, at least to me,
Hmm.
the FIFA Foundation.
Yeah, that's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Because we think of FIFA as just the entity that hands out the World Cup trophy. But looking at what the foundation actually does, they are operating in spaces usually reserved for international aid organizations.
They are. The Foundation's mandate includes promoting positive social change, but crucially, it also involves raising support for the recovery and reconstruction of damaged or destroyed sports infrastructure worldwide.
Wait, really? So if a natural disaster wipes out a region's sporting facilities, the foundation steps in to rebuild?
Yes, they are literally doing global infrastructure reconstruction.
That is wild. Add that to the fact that they have entire internal divisions dedicated to sustainability, human rights and anti-discrimination, health, medical research, education initiatives. If you step back and look at the whole picture, how much of their identity is actually wrapped up in global development rather than just sports administration?
Well, at this level of scale, I would argue you really cannot separate the two.
You think so?
Yeah, you cannot administer a truly global sport without engaging in global development.
Yeah.
If you want a 211 nation tournament to be competitive and inspiring, you have to ensure that nations with fewer economic resources still have the medical research, the coaching education, and the infrastructure to compete.
So the ultimate goal of all this bureaucracy is developmental parity.
Exactly.
And they're building an entire culture around it to reinforce that mission. Like they utilize the FIFA Legends program, bringing in former top players and coaches from both the men's and women's games.
Yes, the ambassador.
Right. They use these iconic figures to travel the world and leverage their celebrity to support these wider development goals. They even operate the FIFA Museum to preserve the history and heritage of the World Cup.
It's all very intentional.
They aren't just governing a game, they are actively curating a shared global history.
They're constructing a distinct cultural identity by combining the historical preservation of the museum with the forward-looking advocacy of the Legends program. They create a narrative that justifies the massive administrative engine.
Yeah, it gives it a soul.
Exactly. It reminds the member associations, the fans, and the corporate sponsors why the rules, the tribunals, and the committees exist in the first place.
It fundamentally changes how you watch the game. When a player steps onto the pitch, you aren't just watching an athlete. You're watching the end result of an incredibly complex, century-old global machine.
It really is.
So to briefly recap the journey we've taken today on this deep dive, we started with the philosophical agreement back in 1904 to standardize a game. From there, we explored how that agreement evolved into a sprawling organization managing 211 member nations. We saw how they intentionally separate their power between a legislative Congress and an executive council to balance the politics of a one country, one vote system.
The Parliament and the Board of Directors.
Exactly. Then we unpacked their dedicated legal framework, the football tribunal and ethics committees, that completely bypasses traditional international courts to rapidly enforce rules across borders.
The closed-loop system.
Right. And finally, we followed the money, seeing how the billions generated by massive tournaments are funneled into regional development offices, women's series events in places like Mauritania and Cote d'Ivoire, and infrastructure rebuilding through the FIFA Foundation.
It is a masterclass in transnational organizational engineering.
It really is.
And if I can leave you with one final thought to mull over, it's this.
Go for it.
If an organization successfully governs 211 member nations, which, again, is more than the recognized nations of the United Nations, if it operates its own dedicated Supreme Courts, maintains its own legislative branches, drives global infrastructure rebuilding initiatives, and enforces its own human rights standards, at what point does a sports governing body stop being just a sports organization and start functioning like a global geopolitical nation of its own?
Wow. A geopolitical nation without borders, held together entirely by a set of rules and the love of a game.
Exactly.
That is a brilliant provocation to end on. The next time you see a referee blow a whistle, just remember the immense invisible machinery that gave them the authority to do it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures behind the things you love, keep exploring, and we will catch you next time.